I did not do a new printout this morning because we're going to finish up with what we started a couple of weeks ago. Is there anybody that was not here that needs a printout for session 3? Anybody? Y'all have one? You're welcome. Anybody else? Does that mean go back or what?
Thank you, sir.
Yep. So I hope everybody's doing well. Looks like we have a little holiday hangover this morning because crowd's kind of slim. But we'll go ahead and get started. So last week we did not, or week before last, we did not finish up with session 3, and I did want to spend some additional time making sure we've got that covered. So what we're trying to emphasize in this particular session is how the Hebrew Bible differs from what we'll call the Christian Bible. And I've done a printout of a large one, and it's duplicated basically verbatim on page 8 of the printout. And if you'll notice that, it's listed as the Hebrew Bible is called the Tanakh. It's divided into three sections versus what we usually find in the Christian Bible, five sections that we have divided up. When we spent some time talking about when Christ in Luke chapter 24 referred to himself and the teachings that he went over with those folks on the road to Emmaus, remember that. And also right after that, when he was gathered with the apostles and disciples in the room, he basically repeated the same thing, and he used two different to the Hebrew or the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament. And he talked about Moses in one section, and I know I'm cutting out, I don't know why. And then he repeated that and added Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. And when you look on this, so I hope you have access to that again on page 8. The Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh, is divided into three sections, the first being the Torah. They are identical to what we find in Christian or Protestant Bible, those first ones. Then the Hebrew Bible is divided into prophets and writings. That's where Tanakh, T-A-N-A-K, or T-A-N-A-K-H, depending on what you read, is derived from. The Hebrew word for prophet is Nevi'im, where the im and the writings are referred to as Ketuvim. So that's the K. So the obvious question, or at least it was to me, is where does Tanakh, the A's, come from? And a little discourse on Hebrew language, which you may or may not be familiar with. Hebrew is one of those languages that we find in the Middle East and those parts of the country called Semitic languages. There are many, we don't really understand that in the English language, but there are quite a few languages that you find in the world that do not use vowels. Did you know that? Hebrew is one of those. So when you find Hebrew written out, it's only consonants that you find. So T-N-K is where they get that. When you find generally, especially in old ancient Hebrew, this is pretty consistent, that when you see the words written, they're not going to have vowels in it. However, do you know of any language, and Hebrew that's not the only one, a lot of, especially, so they use consonants only. But when they're spoken, you got to put a vowel in it. It just doesn't stand to reason that you can say consonants without linking them together in some way. So Tanakh, T-A-N-A-K, is just the way to speak the written language. Does that make sense to you? It's kind of interesting to do that. So when you look at this, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in just a moment, but before we do that, have you ever seen Hebrew written? We're going to go over that, hopefully, if we can use the internet next week. We're going to look at scrolls, which are very...
You raise your arm, Joel cuts out. So you got to talk about food.
I can't talk if you don't do that. It's kind of like Hebrew. I don't know how to say it without raising my arms. My arms are the vowels, okay? Where was I? Oh, Hebrew language. Have you ever seen that written out? Or a lot of Mideastern, a lot of languages. It's written from right to left instead of, as we typically see, from left to right. Now that creates a lot of confusion, but only in our brains. You know, just like the English drive on the wrong side of the road, they would have trouble driving on the right side of the road. So if our brains are familiar with reading from right to left, we don't have any problem with that. They would have ours. If you want to get an example of it, take something, just a page, hold it up to the mirror, and see if you don't have trouble reading it backwards. Not only does, the flow go back, also the words, the letters are also flipped too. So you've got a lot of stuff that goes in there. However, if you took English and took out the vowels, could you read it? Probably so. You know, most things that we see, is kind of a shortcut for them, kind of a way that they would use writing, and what did the stenographers used to do in shorthand, and that's a lot of what they did, was take out vowels and abbreviate the language. So the Hebrew is really no different. Interestingly enough, too, there's a lot fewer words in Hebrew than there are in the English language. We have approximately 60,000 different words. They had about 7,000 words. Greek, interestingly enough, has about the same number. Even Old Greek has about the same number we do, about 60,000. So I think you can understand the complexity of interpretation of Hebrew into Greek or English or whatever the case might be. So you'll see, if you're reading some of these ancient texts, that you'll have a small sentence which, when it's interpreted or transposed or whatever, my mind's gone blank, but it gets this big because we have a lot of different words and they conveyed. This is especially true when you're dealing with tense and parts of the English language and Spanish that we take kind of for granted. There's a lot of interpretation that has to be done through there. So a lot of times when you see in these Old Testament texts, or maybe your study Bible will have notes about this is not found in the original manuscript or whatever, that there may be some issues in changing that from Hebrew to Greek to the English language. Any questions about that aspect of things? I'm glad that's as clear as mud. What do you notice about these three divisions in Hebrew, if you have your sheet? Everybody got that? I do. I'll put them back here. The question is, does the division make a difference? Is it important? And I think that's exactly the same thing as lesson 3, but again, I didn't want everybody just to grab one if you already had one there. And I only printed about 15 copies of that, so hang on to it. Does it make a difference how things are divided? The same number of books, exactly the same thing that we have in the Protestant Bible, Christian Bible, but the order is distinctively different other than the first set. I notice where we have history, they also have aspects of history, but they call them the prophets. So they've got the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. We don't usually consider Judges and Kings as prophetic type books. And they have the latter prophets. We do recognize those. And then the last group that we have are the writings, they call them. The writings are interesting. They're kind of a lump of everything else, really. Not that they don't have importance, because obviously they do, and I think they had importance to those people, Israelites, and the Jews in the time of Jesus and prior to that. But notice down there, like Ruth and Daniel are lumped along with the writings, where we consider those in other places. So where we have history, wisdom books, and prophets, then theirs was a different order. Now, why is it important? Can you think of any practical reason why this would even come to be noticed? Well, the main thing, it seems like, is this was what Jesus would have referred to. This was what the Hebrews and Israelites of that day, those in the synagogue, those in the temple, when they talked about the writings, remember we discussed that, that's the common name for the Hebrew Bible, is the scriptures or the writings. So that's what Jesus would have read. That's what he talked about. And that's what the pages here on the sheet refer to. Let's use, and then we'll come back to some stuff. We talked about what he referred to in Luke. There is a scripture found in take your Bibles and let's look at that, or read along with me in Luke chapter 11, verse 51. and you'll kind of, I think, get a grasp and understand kind of what we're talking about. It says, this is Jesus talking. He says, "Therefore this generation will be held responsible for the blood of all the prophets that has been shed since the beginning of the world, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the sanctuary." What do you notice about that verse that Jesus spoke? Anything unusual? Abel? And my first initial assumption was Zechariah is what? Z. But remember, that's in the English language. So I don't know how pertinent it was to Jesus as far as the A to Z, the alphabetical part. You probably don't know, because I didn't know, where the reference to Zechariah comes into play. It's kind of an obscure prophet. Do you know where it's found? Any guess? But if you turn over toward the end of Chronicles, then that's where you're going to find reference to Zechariah and being killed. What's the last book of the Hebrew Bible? It's right in front of you. Chronicles. So when Jesus was talking about this particular statement and talking about Abel to Zechariah, rather than being in alphabetical order, he's talking about a biblical order. From the first of the Hebrew Bible, first of the Old Testament, to the last of the Old Testament, he says this generation is going to be responsible for all the blood and all the killings that have taken place in this sense. Does that make sense? So again, when Jesus is talking about the Scriptures, he's talking about a different order than what we had seen. Again, what I want you to understand and grasp on this is the way that perhaps we look at the Old Testament might make a difference in the story that's being told. Again, what was Jesus, if you refer back to lesson 2, what was the takeaway from Jesus when he was explaining to these people about the Scriptures? What was his message? Do you remember? That the Anointed One, Christ, the title that was given to the high priest and to kings, the Anointed One, Christ, would do what? 2 things. He would suffer and be crucified or condemned to death, that he would come through on the other end, in other words, he would be resurrected, so that what would happen? A new beginning would occur based on what? You remember? A new beginning, meaning we would be rescued, salvation and rescue that would be based on trust. Can you think of a better way to sum up what the good news of the gospel is all about? I can't, because it's coming right from the mouth of Jesus when he explained about what the Scriptures were talking about from the beginning to the end. So that's what we're trying to grasp. This aspect of looking at the Old Testament is confirmed, or just to be made clear that this was just not something that was come up with. When you look at these people that are listed on chapter 9, the wisdom of Ben Sira. He wrote, and if I'm not mistaken, this was about 100 years prior to Jesus. He wrote a book of wisdom that was some 50 chapters long, so quite lengthy. This statement was actually written by his grandson, who would have been more around the time of Jesus, talking about his grandfather. He says, many great teachings have been given to us through the law, or the Torah, and the prophets, the Nevi'im, and the others that follow them are the Ketuvim. So my grandfather, Yeshua, devoted himself especially to the readings of the law and the prophets and the other scrolls of our ancestors. What would you denote that was important to this man that wrote 50 chapters of wisdom writings? You don't have to be that shy. We're not gonna bite. What would be important to him if he devoted himself to what? The Torah, to Moses, to the prophets, and to the other writings. The Old Testament would have been, what we call the Old Testament, would have been important to him. This is also emphasized by this Philo of Alexandria. The laws and the oracles given by inspiration through the prophets and the Psalms and the other scrolls whereby knowledge and piety are increased and completed. It's interesting to know that often, even in the New Testament, it's somewhere in the King James Version of the New Testament, that these writings, the Ketuvim, are referred to in two different ways, Psalms and David. Where would David come from? Think. It's really pretty clear. David would be associated primarily with what? The Psalms. He's the paramount writer of most of the, I think, 70-something of the Psalms. So when you think of the shortcut and the reference to the writings of the Old Testament, it's shorthand Psalms, or in some cases, David. So see, a lot of times when we read these sayings by Jesus or Paul or the other New Testament writings, it kind of gives an idea of what they were talking about. They were talking about the Old Testament. Now remember, two aspects. These were composed of scrolls. And we'll look at that next week when we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. Scrolls were long in some cases. They were composed mostly at this time of animal skins, leather, that were written by scribes and literally stitched together and then rolled up. This is what they would find in the temple or perhaps a large synagogue. Most people didn't see those. Most people that lived in the country, number one, a lot of them couldn't read. There were literate people. Most of them were boys, of course. They would study. Paul studied. So they learned, in some cases, to read, but in other cases, they did not. It was based on, as we've discussed before, oral tradition, memorization, and songs, just like you find in the Psalms. So when you have a group of people that grow up and they've memorized, they've heard, and they've sung about something, then the writings, the scriptures of the Old Testament would have been something that they would have encompassed more than actually seen physically. They may have seen it, especially if they have gone down for holidays to Jerusalem. But this whole aspect is different, I think, from our concept of the Old Testament, where we just grab a book and look at it. Does that make sense? When were books first started to be written as we look at books? Pardon? Before then. Between 2 and 300 AD. So again, when Christ was looking and talking about Scripture, he was talking about something that was on the scroll. No, I'm talking about books in general. It's called a codex. And when you look at the codex, C-O-D-E-X is what we refer to as a Bible. It's very unique. And when you think of all the information that we can put into a book, you ever looked at book printing? It's kind of fascinating if you go to an old place. But if you look at your book, you're going to find that there are very small sections printed front and back page that are stitched together. And then many, many stitchings are combined into a book. Point being that you can get an awful lot of information in a book that they would have had to have had a large scroll. Typically, when it says the 12 on the left-hand side under prophets, that was usually put on one scroll, a large scroll. And I've read some sizes of these, and if I'm not mistaken, some of them were up to 25 feet long on scrolls. Not all of them were, but they would lump them together. Obviously, they were very, very rare. They were very expensive, and they were not something that the typical person was going to have access to. What else would be unique if you expand this? What would be unique about a scroll, a leather scroll, that was read or handled repeatedly? What would happen to it? It would wear out, yeah. What would be the first things that would wear out? When you first started to take the scroll apart, and when you got to the end of it, so that when it started again, you would have to roll it back out. So rolling it out, rolling it up would have had a lot of wear and tear on these scrolls. Again, when you look at, as we hope to, the Dead Sea Scrolls as an example, and that was only one. It's very obvious, the fact that these things existed as long as they did. So we've got that aspect of the Bible. Point being, again, just to emphasize this, is that the scrolls were what Jesus would have been using. They didn't have it in book form until several hundred years after his death. Interestingly enough, it's believed pretty significantly that the expansions of the codex, the book, creation of books and distribution of books, occurred because of the Jesus movement in the 2nd and 3rd century. That's interesting. Because of that, a lot of the writings that took place were actually preserved and held on to because of the Christian movement. Caleb, it's been within the last year. Do you remember when he did several lessons on how we got the Bible. Do you remember that? He talked briefly about some of this aspect, but it's important to remember a lot of these writings that took place occurred in what is called the Second Temple writings. What would have been referred to as Second Temple writings? It's not. It makes a lot of sense. First temple would have been what? Whose temple? Whose? Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple was built. It was a magnificent structure, but it was destroyed when? You remember? A lot of biblical history about this time. The Babylonian captivity in, I think, 580 something along in there. When they came in, they sacked the city, they took the people out, and they destroyed the temple. The temple began to be rebuilt in very limited aspects when? Before then. There's 2 books in the Bible that talk about the beginnings of the temple after exile. Who was one? Nehemiah and Ezra. So when Ezra, you read that story, read that book in the Bible, and it talks about them being allowed to come back and the initial rebuilding of the temple, the Second Temple. Now, there were a lot of additions between Ezra's time and New Testament in Christ's time. So the temple had been restored, rebuilt in Jerusalem, not nearly to the magnificence it was in Solomon's time, but still significantly better and larger. So during this time, especially during these some 400 to 500 years, there was a lot of Second Temple writings. Judaism had become very diverse. There's a lot of history there, a lot of history. And we're not going to get into that. But there were many books that had been written on scroll form and been completed that people took great interest in. Some of those you can go back and still look at it. Just an example of this 50 chapter issue of this Ben Shira would have been one example. So a lot of information was out there. A lot of discourse was taking place. A lot of commentaries that were written. You go back and look, and there are multiple commentaries for the book of Isaiah. So you had a lot of, at this time, educated priests who were writing back and forth about different things. Also interesting, though, is during this aspect of Judaism and the changes that were taking place in Judaism as the Romans and the Greeks and other cultures had come into place, you found a lot of changes as far as the legal system was concerned. Remember, they didn't have, basically at the time of Jesus, the political system and the religious system was one and the same. They didn't have a lot of change. Tim, do you have a question?
How far down the line was Josephus from this?
He was afterwards.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, he was writing sometime in the first century. So, and again, codex in the book form didn't take place until the second and third. So even at his time, it took about 300 years, 200 to 300 years for scrolls to gradually go out of style and book form come into style. So it wasn't just click, it's a done deal. It took place over a period of time. But there were a lot of changes that had taken place in the religious and the political system of the Jews in Israel. A lot of disagreement. When you read in the New Testament, we find evidence of that. We had Pharisees, we had Sadducees, we had Zealots, and we have indirectly reference to Essenes. There were a lot of priests that were basically forced out by the current situation because of their disagreement with the political structure and their disagreement with the course and holding on to traditional Jewish tradition that they were trying to maintain. Those people, and there were many of them, basically moved down the road about 20 miles to Qumran, which was a settlement about 20 miles from Jerusalem in the mountains. There they had a lot of writings that they did back and forth from priest to priest. These were not common people, these were priests that had been forced out by the political situation. And so you had a lot of people that were very anxious, a minority of people who were very anxious to hold on to the writings that took place in these scrolls that happened. That's what a big reason that Jesus was so aggravated and so angry at a lot of the hierarchy in the Jewish folks, especially in the Sadducees and the Pharisees. There was put arms down. There was a distinct sense that what they were implementing and the direction that they were going was opposite of what so much of the old scriptures were really intended to be. He was frustrated. We know that. We can read that because they had their laws. They had their 500, 600, 700 things that they wanted to hold on to, the Pharisees, but it was not the intent of what the Old Testament was written about. By the way, when did the term Old Testament come into play? Again, several hundred years down the road from when Jesus' time, there wasn't a New and an Old Testament. Obviously, the New Testament was being written by the apostles, all, to our knowledge, or there may be some discrepancy, all Jewish writers. This was most of our New Testament was part of this Second Temple writings. We forget that sometime. When would the Second Temple writings cease to exist? What did Jesus talk about a lot in the New Testament, especially toward the end of his ministry, that was to come? The destruction of Jerusalem. That took place in AD 70. AD 70. Most of the New Testament was written during this period of time. One exception that I can think of is the Apostle John. John did most of his writing way down the road when he was not a relative, he was an old man. So it's believed that a lot of his writings, John, the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Revelation, written somewhere about AD 90. We don't have any real proof of this, but there seems to be some connection that the Gospel of John was written because he was basically encouraged to do that before he died, so that a first-hand account would be given of his time spent with Christ. And obviously, when you read John, it's very apparent that his is a much more personal and less than a narrative situation of the Gospels dealing with Jesus. 1st, 2nd, and John, 3rd John, pretty well the same way on that. So just a little insight there. Are there any questions or comments that we've got?
Well, with Christ here in verses 49 through the remainder of chapter 11 there, is he not prophesying against the things that are going to happen when they destroy it?
A lot of that is, yeah, and after that takes place.
Early next century.
Well, in 70 AD. 70 AD. It's really interesting because after the temple was completely, after Jerusalem was completely destroyed, then the Jews were even dispersed even more than what they have. Hebrew as a language became basically a dead language for many, many years. Because as they left and went to other countries, by this time, even before Jesus' time, the Bible, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, had already been translated into Greek. So they had access to a Greek Hebrew Bible. It wasn't necessarily always written in Hebrew. So again, you have external sources coming in and filtered, and as the people dispersed, then Hebrew as a language became less and less and less used because they became more dependent on the Greek Bible to be used. It's really interesting. We have movies that have been made, and Judaism is not unique. But it's certainly a great example of, how traditions are held on to. What happens over a period of time when you are one sect of people and you're displaced or moved or what happened. And, we can certainly understand that. The world filters in, doesn't it? And so you have more and more Jews who are exposed to different customs, different languages, and that stays in place really for a long time that we have. You think back, what's the movie that he sings a lot? Fiddler on the Roof. Wasn't that in Russia? I believe is where that movie took place on that in the 1800s, and yet that was their struggle, is how do we deal with the contemporary world and still hold on to the traditions that we have. That I feel quite sure. When you look at current Judaism, it has changed and turned into more of a traditional type holding, more than a true religion, especially in different countries. Now you get over into Israel, and it's a different situation for a lot of them. As I've said before, they're still looking for the Messiah, and I think a lot of current Jews, especially those that are not Orthodox Jews, look at their religion more as a tradition more than anything else on it. So a little insight there. Other questions? Well, I hope that you are grasping a little bit of what we're trying to talk about and trying to get across. So next week, keep our fingers crossed. We'll take a look at some of these scrolls and look and begin to kind of formulate on how these things were maintained, how they were maintained from the time of Moses and way up until the time of Jesus, because 2,000 years is a long time to try to hold on to something that started off being able to be written on a rock, for sure. All right, thanks everybody.